Okay, Paul, I've muted everybody, including you. I see your lips moving.
We have your screen, Paul, but you're still muted. Still muted. Still muted.
There we go. I think
Now you are. There you are.
maybe our voice is on.
Yes, you are.
All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, friends, brothers and sisters. So good to have you share with us again this evening, and I am pleased to be able to welcome you to another of the Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum presentations. I want to ask your indulgence this evening because with this Memorial Day weekend, it has given me pause, and because I have one more special memorial that I haven't had before. And so at the Joseph Smith home, we have put out white crosses that we allowed people to decorate, and we ended up with about 15 that people put names on. And of course, I put Rena's name on one. But in the process of all that, as usual, I was motivated with the poem, and so I'd like to share that with you to begin with this evening. It's called Islands in the Ocean of Time. Each of us is an island, beset by currents and waves, washed by thunderstorms of time from our birth to our graves. Isolated, yet surrounded by an ocean of humanity, so small, so insignificant in the seas of infinity. Yet something there is about us, like the island with its mountain peak, something marvelous reaching through the clouds toward connection we seek. Something, too, in the reefs we establish to protect us from the storms, and the bridges we build to one another in friendship's social norms. We know our archipelago, our mother gave us birth, and most have the assurance of some essential worth. But out of sight, out of mind, they are distant. We are alone, to be ourselves islands, frontiers, marking our own time zone. The cemetery tells us with names honored by birth and death that our probation washes away when we run out of breath. So who we are and whose we are as we face the ocean of time depends upon our archipelago of relationships, giving meaning and rhyme. Who? Depends significantly upon the accident of fame and upon the fossicular cognates hiding within our name. Our oceans of time and society gnaw boulders into sand, grinding, smoothing, shaping with the force of a divine hand. History gives us glimpses, stories from our past, yet not but snapshots of who we might have been when our lot was cast. Archaeology digs up artifacts, fragments, truth-telling hints, rarely enough to know ourselves, reassembly requiring splints. And splinted fragments rarely grow back enough for a picture frame, leaving truth-telling fragments in a box, a past reality to reclaim. Our island, on an island, connects to give it worth. Interconnecting archipelagos cover the oceans of Earth. And Earth is but an island in the greater ocean of space. It too must embrace its identity as waves gnaw upon its face. It too carries its tombstones, ages marked by birth and death, swept over by the thunderstorms, gentle breezes giving breath. Oh, how beautiful our island, how blessed to be its child, how marvelous to eat its fruit, to breathe its currents mild, to swim, to dive, to look for pearls, to find occasional gems, to bridge our isolations, to find relationships along our stems, to be, as we are, islands, embraced in an eternity of waves, yet significant in the eternal ocean, potentially beyond our graves. And then, moving on, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you to a presentation by James Lucas and Val Larson. The two have worked together, and they have been friends for many years. James Lucas has published with Jonathan Neville several times, and we've had their material presented. And Val has been a regular participant and presenter as well. And so it's a real pleasure to invite them back, welcome them back tonight to address us with the relationship between First Nephi, or I think we're talking primarily about Lehi's vision and the story of Deuteronomy. And because they have studied Book of Mormon topics and have numerous books available, I simply would encourage you to look them up and proceed to cite them and read them yourselves, because here are two of the finest scholars of the Book of Mormon of the modern day. So thank you, gentlemen, for your research and for your effort to teach the scriptural message. Thank you for coming to be available with us this evening. And oh, here, I failed to get the picture in. Let us pray together anyway. Through the eons of time, awesome Creator, you have offered guidance to mankind. Too often, guidance we have ignored. You have invited us to love you, to love each other. You have given commandments to simplify your word. You have spoken in parables to encourage us prodigals to return to follow your way. And you have illustrated your power in thunder, earthquakes, volcanoes, gentle breezes, encouraging us to listen to what you have to say. And here we are, a world at war, nations with empires politically riven, personal vendettas, group against group, struggling, angry, driven, having yet to learn compassion, yet to follow the iron rod, yet to be good stewards of the vineyard, yet to appreciate that you are God. This evening, we come before you to ask your blessing on our presenters, Val and James, to help us come to focus upon your guidance, your long-term patience, grace, and aims. And bless our participants and those who later watch on YouTube and review, that we will choose to be a people who learn to love even as you do, and as demonstrated in the resurrection of Jesus, in whose name we pray. Amen.
Paul,
Yes, Monty?
just one moment before you start in. I just wanted to let you know that I found your poem beautiful and an appropriate tribute, and I know she was listening.
Thank you. She has, she continues. Let me just share momentarily, because we had Bob and Becky Smith have been our co-workers at Nauvoo since 2012. Kathleen and they're from Utah. Kathleen and Boyce Black have come from Washington, and they've been on our archaeological team for about 6 years. Mary and Rebecca from Burlington. The Armstrongs have been coming to Nauvoo to work with me for 10 years. all of them, all 8 of them came this last Saturday to dig at Joseph Smith home. And to my amazement, they brought pictures of a flower bed that they have planted at Nauvoo, with a rhododendron in the center to celebrate Rena. All right, Val and James, I haven't seen if James has gotten here yet, but there he is. Okay. Well, James, I have gotten the screen share off, and so the floor is yours. I think James wanted to go first.
Yes, actually, for the most part, I will be presenting this week, and then Val will be presenting next week.
Yes.
Although when we get into discussion, I'm sure Val will have much useful things to say. So just one second here. Let's get our there we go. Now, screen share. Here we go. And slideshow from beginning. Okay, do you see my slides?
Yes,
Yes.
we do.
Okay. All right. So this evening's presentation is based on a presentation that Val and I and another of our colleagues did at the Book of Mormon Expo a little over a month ago. It seemed to be fairly well received. We had a standing room only audience. I'd say, 200, 300 people. And a lot of people seem to enjoy it. So we'll see what you folks all think of it. This is entitled Lehi, Jerusalem, and Nauvoo. I'm mostly going to be talking about the Jerusalem part, and then Val will be talking about the Nauvoo part. Let's see. There we go. So to set the stage here, 2 of the biggest scholarly criticisms of the Book of Mormon are the following. One is that there's too much Jesus in the Old Testament time frame, and the other is that there's too little of later Nauvoo era doctrines. Now, I know lots of you on this video will maybe think that the latter is all to better, but I think we all have heard the criticism that the Book of Mormon is, in fact, the pre-Christian time frame is far more explicit about predictions of Jesus than in anything that we find in the Old Testament. So, for example, here's a quote. Scholars without a bias say that they hold the Book of Mormon was not a record written by Eastern immigrants in the Western Hemisphere, sorry for the typo, from 600 BCE, but authored by Joseph Smith. They argue the Book of Mormon has limited grasp of the specifics of Israelite life and also reflect the idea and texts that were available to someone living in the Eastern United States in the 18th century or 19th century. For these people, explicitly detailed Christian prophecies and anachronisms that mar the book's credibility as an ancient document. And this is, I think, a longstanding criticism. It's a criticism that comes kind of from all corners. Obviously, kind of secular-oriented scholars, will point to this. But even this fellow here is a evangelical pastor who has settled in Utah and opened an outreach to Latter-day Saints. He has a podcast called Hello Saints. And as part of his outreach, he read the Book of Mormon. And I haven't not skilled enough to excerpt the actual video, but his primary reaction to First Nephi was there's too much Jesus in it. In other words, he says he also, even though he's coming from a relatively conservative evangelical perspective, says that the prophecies of Jesus and the talk about Jesus in the First Nephi is just goes far beyond anything that's in the Old Testament. So he also found that to be objectionable. Now, again, I know this will be a point of some discussion here, but another criticism is that if the Book of Mormon contains the fullness of the gospel, what about all this stuff that Joseph Smith came up with in Nauvoo? And so this is a quote from Grant Palmer, who was a religious education teacher for the LDS Church until he left, and then became a very prominent critic of the church. And and so this is from one of his most prominent books. And the thing is, even if one rejects or has questions about the Nauvoo era doctrines that Joseph Smith came up with, it nonetheless still is a criticism of the Book of Mormon that, it's an argument that we used for saying this is just Joseph Smith writing. It just reflects Joseph Smith's 1828 understanding of Christianity, because obviously it doesn't have anything in it that relates to what he later came up with, regardless of what one thinks of that. So these are two prominent criticisms. So an English Methodist grandma to the rescue. So we'd like to introduce you. Some of you may be familiar with her, but I introduce you to Margaret Barker. Margaret Barker is English. She's a Methodist and is a brilliant Bible scholar. So here are just quickly some of her credentials. She was president of the Society for Old Testament Study, and apparently to be a member of the Society for Old Testament Study, one must be completely fluent in biblical Hebrew. So that's the membership of this society, and they have elected her their president. She's written 17 books in series, and there's not just like a book on one topic and then on another topic. This is a continuous argument that she has built over the course of decades in these 17 different books. She's participated in symposia convened by the Eastern Orthodox Church. She was awarded the Doctor of Divinity by the Archbishop of Canterbury for her work in the Jerusalem Temple and the origins of Christian liturgy. And she's cited very extensively in biblical literature. Among other fans of hers are N.T. Wright, who, if some of you may be familiar with, is probably one of the most prominent and well-known Bible scholars active today. And what I think is interesting for those of us from Restoration traditions, she has also served as a Methodist lay preacher for over 30 years. She deliberately chose to not pursue an academic career. I mean, she went to Oxford. She could very well have become, the first prominent woman academic professor of Bible. Her credentials were hailed, but she elected to instead, she supported herself by serving as a teacher at a Methodist sort of the equivalent of a high school in the UK. And then she just produced all of these books and articles for decades and decades. So she's in her 80s now. So she began her career in the 1970s. So for 20 years, over 20 years, she was producing books, producing work, making her arguments, being involved in biblical studies in the UK. And the first time that a Latter-day Saint noticed her work was in 1999, a man named Kevin Christensen, who's a computer guy. He lives in Pittsburgh. And he brought her work to the attention of other LDS scholars through the old organization FARMS. Some of you may have been familiar with it back in the day. It doesn't exist anymore. he would use farms as a vehicle to say, hey, you need to read this work by this woman, Margaret Barker, and why he was so enthusiastic about her work we'll get to in the next couple slides. So she was, so folks got in touch with her. She was invited to BYU. She's in 2003. In 2005, at the bicentennial of Joseph Smith's birth, 1805 to 2005, there was a large convocation, a special session at the Library of Congress in honor of Joseph's 200th bicentennial. And she presented a paper. And in her paper, she said that First Nephi, in her view, was a very accurate description of Jerusalem in 600 BCE, which, wowed a lot of people, that she would stand up and say that at this very prestigious academic conference. She since has continued her association with LDS scholars. She's spoken at conferences and contributed papers. Excuse me, I'm missing. Oh, there we go. She's been cited by LDS scholars like Daniel Peterson, Noel Reynolds, and John Welch. Although she was, known in the sort of BYU-based LDS scholarly community, little note was taken of her beyond that circle until just very recently. And very recently, two of our two sort of amateur scholars, one named Dave Butler, who is an attorney, and the other is our very own Val Larson, began to take her work and expand it, write books, publish articles, and being very eloquent people, they broke into the LDS podcast world. I don't know how many of you have the benefit or curse of being following YouTube, podcasts on restoration topics, but it's just blown up in the last couple of years. Some of the prominent people are Rick Bennett, who is sometimes a participant here in the forum. Steve Pinecker established his reputation, who's also been a participant in the forum. So suddenly Dave and Val started to appear on podcasts, and there was a sudden expansion of interest in these things beyond the sort of rather insular LDS academic sphere. So why are LDS scholars drawn to her work? So now we're getting into a little bit of the substance. So her argument, and this is, and again, an argument that she came by over a period of 20 or 30 years before she encountered anybody from the Restoration traditions. That was that the original religion of Israel, and it was the faith of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, was as follows. It was not monotheistic. There was a Father God, the Most High God, El Elohim. There was a Mother God called, sometimes called Asherah, and they had a son, God the Son, and that was Jehovah. And Jehovah and the God the Son and El Elohim, God the Father, were separate and also considered to be corporeal. Now, this was not a view invented by Margaret Barker. This is, in fact, widely accepted in secular Bible scholarship, that this was the ancient religion, and that Judaism became monotheistic only over the course of centuries, but that it did not start as a monotheistic religion. This is now broadly accepted. But she took this, and instead of seeing it as a sort of a critique of sort of the traditional Judeo-Christian faith, she ran with it and said, no, this is in fact something that is going to lead us to Christ in the New Testament, because she's a religious person. Other things that she has focused on are that the temple, she considers the temple to have been far more important in early Israelite religion than appeared even later, even though Judaism has always been very temple-centric, but nonetheless, she came out and did deep research. This is some of the stuff that really she is known for on the first temple, and focused on ordinances, rituals of the first temple, and beliefs that were designed to bring the people to God the Father, El Elohim. So she, wrote books and books about this kind of thing. She argued that the temple of Jerusalem, the early faith was not in any way Jerusalem-centric, that any prophet could set up an altar and it would be a holy altar. And this was Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did this, and so did Lehi. And she acknowledges that Lehi's decision to set up an altar was simply standing in the tradition of the ancient patriarchs. She argued that the ancient faith of Israel was God was represented by king priests, and that Melchizedek was one of the primary examples of these. And we see that continuing in the Book of Mormon with Nephi and his successor, and that the visions and revelations to prophets were extremely important in the religion, the ancient religion of Israel. And this is where, it starts to, some of the really original contributions start. She says that this heritage of faith is survived into the times of Christ, and that therefore, in fact, there is much in the Old Testament, if you kind of know how to look at it, or if you look at it the way she looks at it, which is in fact anticipating Christ. So in particular, she zeroes in on the era of the 6th century BCE, just before the Babylonian captivity, which of course is of great interest to Book of Mormon believers because that's the time of Lehi. And so this was the presentation she made before the Library of Congress, and she has made this, published this and made this argument that she finds the description of Lehi's Jerusalem in the Book of Mormon in the First Nephi to be very accurate to what her conclusions are about the state of Israel and Israelite religion at that time. So what happened in Lehi's time? So her argument is that after the 500 BCE, the kings and high priests of Jerusalem centralized control over Israelite religion. This is after the northern kingdom has fallen. So they're now the lone surviving representatives of Israel, and they consolidated political and religious control over Israelite religion at Jerusalem. This is when El Elohim and Jehovah were combined. Instead of being God the Father and God the Son as separate deities, were combined into a single being without body, parts, or passions. They eliminated the Heavenly Mother. They completely destroyed all signs, who was very widely worshipped in Israelite society and religion prior to this. They completely destroyed all references to her. And then they produced an emphasis on following the law rather than revelation. And most importantly, she argues they edited the scriptures to fit their views. And they removed or rewrote much of what was in the Old Testament. Many scholars, including Margaret Barker, feel that, in fact, these are the folks who wrote much of the Old Testament that we have. And they threw out things that conflicted with their law monotheistic view of religion. And this is, they're referred to as the Deuteronomists, and this is a term widely known in biblical scholarship. This is not Margaret Barker's term. because they either wrote or heavily rewrote the Book of Deuteronomy and the related histories like the Kings and so forth. So, and there's in critical scholarship, in the documentary hypothesis, there's the E and the J and the P and the D, and these folks had their own way of writing in Hebrew, and so they're the D in the documentary hypothesis, who are not found in many parts of the Bible, Old Testament, but do dominate the histories and the Book of Deuteronomy. So now at this time, just in the 2nd century or 6th century BCE, when they were introducing this program, this was very serious activity. In other words, this was not just somebody going around preaching saying, gee, we think we should really worship God this way. No, they killed people who disagreed with them. They massacred thousands and thousands of priests who were of a different, who held to the older views. And we see this described in the Book of Mormon. This is, in First Nephi, that, what was Lehi saying to them? He said that that there was there would be a coming of a Messiah and the redemption of worlds. And he was arguing that the things that they were doing at that time were abominations, and and when they heard these things, they were going to kill him. So this is exactly the time when this Deuteronomist reform was taking place. And we can see from the Book of Mormon itself that Lehi was of the old faith, and that was what was getting him into trouble. So this perspective just kind of throws a whole new light on the beginning of the Book of Mormon. And I'd like to just kind of go through here and give one example of what adapting this perspective produces for us. So let's consider Laman and Lemuel. As this is just to illustrate how much impact these views can have on our understanding of the Book of Mormon. So if you just kind of read the Book of Mormon cold, Laman and Lemuel come across as kind of whiny, entitled rich kids. And people, kind of find that, at least let's put it this way, as Nephi portrays them in the Book of Mormon, they come across as being pretty annoying people. However, if we look at them in this context of this understanding of the environment of Jerusalem, now it could be that there still were whiny, bratty, rich kids, spoiled rich kids, but they, if we put them in this environment, we could also see them as quite pious Deuteronomists. So what is it that we learn from the Book of Mormon about Laman and Lemuel's complaints? Well, they complain that Lehi is a visionary man. And in fact, the Deuteronomists specifically renounced visionary people. Dreamers of dreams and prophets are specifically denounced in Deuteronomy in the 13th chapter. Now, it says that this applies to people who are preaching other gods, but the point of Margaret Barker's argument is that the old God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was one of these other gods that they were opposed to, and that they were opposed to prophets who advocated the old religion of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, although they never actually said it that way. So when they complain that their father is a visionary man, that suddenly takes on a lot more meaning if you put it into this Deuteronomist reform context. And while they still must honor their father, which is preserved, the Ten Commandments are preserved in Deuteronomy, it literally says in Deuteronomy 13:6 that they should kill anybody who is such a dreamer. So suddenly that puts their attacks on Nephi in a very different perspective. again, it could be that they were just really irritated with this uppity younger brother of theirs. So I'm not saying that there wasn't a strong human element, but if in fact we put them in this context, they could have felt that they had justification in seeking to take their brother's life. If they argue, the Laman and Lemuel argue that the people of Jerusalem, which was the base of the Deuteronomist movement, that they were a righteous people because they kept the law of Moses. And there's the citations in First Nephi for that. And when Nephi argues with them, this is very interesting, he cites Moses as an example. And if Laman and Lemuel, oops, let's see, go back up. Whoop, I'm sorry. Whoop. Okay, I guess I cannot go forward. Or back. Okay, all right. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm going to have to start and just run back through these slides again. I messed up here. Okay, just bear with me. We will flip through here. We won't make you look at anything. Okay, and anyway, so when Nephi argues with them, he uses Moses as an example. So if Laman and Lemuel were like complete apostates, and they grudgingly agree in this particular verse that we're citing, or is cited here at the bottom of the slide, they accede to Nephi's argument. If these were apostates, just complete apostates and completely rebellious against God, would Lehi been able to use Moses as a persuasive argument with them? But if they were Deuteronomists, who sort of really exalted Moses above the patriarchs and other prophets, then Nephi citing Moses would, in fact, be persuasive to them. So anyway, so many of her views. So anyway, so it just shows how fruitful this research using Margaret Barker's perspectives can be. So Fiona Givens, who's an LDS writer, after listening to this first talk that Margaret Barker gave at the Library of Congress at the observance of the Joseph Smith bicentennial, just wrote that when I read the first 2 chapters of the Book of Mormon, I now see them as historical figures, things like the tree of life, Jesus is Yahweh, the son of El Elyon, the mother in heaven, the Melchizedek priesthood, and so on and so forth. Just, she says, just opened up a whole new world to her. And that is very much the reaction of, again, originally just a very small group of LDS intellectuals, kind of BYU-centered intellectuals, but the stuff didn't get out into the mainstream, but now it is getting out into the mainstream, at least amongst LDS people who follow the YouTube and the new sort of podcasting world that's really gone crazy since the days of COVID. So why, if you have this great Bible scholar with, revered or highly respected in the UK, who is now, saying that the Book of Mormon's got it spot on as far as, 6th century BCE, Jerusalem. So why isn't the Bible studies world rushing to the Book of Mormon? Why isn't everyone who studies the Bible, such as ministers and pastors, jumping at the chance to join the church? And in fact, why don't we hear about Margaret Barker in church? So she is, while a small group of LDS intellectuals have become quite the fans of Margaret Barker, and she is not been adopted officially by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints at all. And I'd be interested to hear from you all whether anything that she's done has been identified or discussed in any of the other Restoration churches. And the answer is not my mainstream. In other words, she is not, she's respected, but she is definitely not in anybody's mainstream. She is very much her own person. So, some of you may be familiar with all this, so I'll just kind of rush through it. So just some background, the historical critical method of the Bible rose in the 1800s, which was basically taking an analytical procedures which had been used to study other kinds of literature and applying to the Bible, and basically the broader body of biblical scholarship over the course of the 1800s, came to see the Bible as more mythology than Holy Scripture, and they saw the Bible as a giant jigsaw puzzle with many pieces missing. Now, there was some resistance to this view in the 1800s and early 1900s. For example, Pope St. Pius X actually banned the historical critical method in the Catholic Church, but that ban was reversed in 1943. And since then, Catholics have, Catholic scholars have jumped in with regular sort of mainstream, mainline Protestant scholars in going, all the way with the historical critical method. There in America, there was some opposition to this, and that's the birth of the fundamentalists. What we call the fundamentalists really originated in the late 1800s, early 1900s, as a opposition to the rapid expansion of the historical critical method in American Protestantism. But they kind of got sidetracked. The social elites in America, criticized them, and they were kind of thrown out of the mainstream due to events like the Scopes, trial in 1923 over evolution. This is a picture of Mr. Scopes at the trial, and that really resulted in a lot of basically the elites of America and Europe basically just pushing the fundamentalist point of view to the side. And now modern historical approach dominates modern biblical studies. If you want to do any kind of scholarly work or academic work in this field, I mean, you simply have to accept the historical critical method as completely dominates the world. But, and this is again to point out how much of an iconoclast she is, Margaret Barker does not approve of this trend. This is a fun quote from her in the second paragraph. There's no such thing as objective biblical scholarship, that is scholarship produced by those with no faith commitment. I often said that a professor of French who had never been to France, who did not know the language, and doubted that France even existed, would not be taken seriously. The same should apply with biblical studies. Ouch. So basically saying if you don't know anything, understand anything about God or religious faith, you don't have any business putting yourself up as a scholar of the Bible. So what she has done is to work within the parameters of modern biblical scholarship, the historical critical method, but to produce a new faith-based paradigm which puts the jigsaw pieces together in a faith-promoting pattern. And this, of course, has brought many LDS scholars to her side. But she is not mainstream. Now, there are people, and she's kind of rejected on two sides. The fundamentalists and our evangelical friends, still very much take that approach, this approach to the Bible. They want to see the Bible as a giant jigsaw puzzle. And they want to say, look, the Bible is, if not completely perfect, is close to perfect, and we still have got to cling to the Bible, or else, we're lost. And now this is a problem for Margaret Barker's approach, because under her argument, and she's not completely alone. Many, from a strictly historical point of view, again, Bible scholars broadly accept the idea that under King Josiah before 600 BCE, there was this Deuteronomist reform. That's not controversial from a biblical point of view, but she basically looks at King Josiah, who was the main sponsor of the Deuteronomist reform, and as the king, he was the one in charge of killing all the priests. Now he had died by the time Lehi came around, but his successor, King Zedekiah, very much continued in his path. And so, again, if you accept this context, this paradigm, these are the people who were trying to kill Lehi. And yet, in the historical, in Kings, it says that, like there were, speaking of King Josiah, like unto him as there was no king before him that turned with all his heart and all his soul, all his might to the law of Moses, neither after him arose any like him. So the Deuteronomists, who it is argued wrote the Book of Kings, they, for them, Josiah was a hero. And this paradigm goes exactly opposite to that. This paradigm says that Josiah was a power-hungry centralizer who was responsible for destroying much of the historical religion of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and killing many prophets who were loyal to the ancient religion of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which would have included Lehi. So the question is, for Book of Mormon believers, is, are we comfortable with her more critical approach, even though it's faith-based? Because her argument is, no, she is a Christian, and she's saying no. If you look back at the ancient religion of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and as it was practiced in the First Temple period, it does look forward to Christ. The Book of Mormon prophets, Lehi and Nephi, were in fact very much in the track of the ancient religion of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in their visions and prophecies of the coming of the Messiah. This is okay. Just kind of a laundry list, and I won't go over every one of these in detail, but these are some of the arguments from an LDS perspective as to why we should be not necessarily accept the Bible as perfect, and which basically enable us to accept or consider seriously Margaret Barker's paradigm, and to say that there could be things in the Bible that are not correct. First of all, we have the Book of Mormon itself tells us. I'm sorry, I used the LDS reference. I didn't plug in the Community of Christ reference here, but that many plain and precious things were taken away from the book. We have the Book of Mormon cites prophets who do not appear in the Old Testament, Zenock and Zenos and Nahum. There, even in the Old Testament itself, there are numerous references to other books which the writers of the Old Testament clearly considered to be valid, the valid Word of God. So there's just a laundry list of some of these other works that are referred to. We have the Article of Faith, which is that the Bible is the Word of God as far as translated correctly. And again, we might say as far as translated and transmitted correctly, that would be the argument. We have the fact that Joseph Smith produced the inspired translation of the Bible, which we accept across the Restoration traditions, and those I'm sure many on this call are very familiar with the inspired translation, and Joseph Smith changed a lot of stuff. I mean, and he added lots of stuff. Now, it's we can argue about whether it was supposedly things that were in the Bible originally, or whether these were new revelations that Joseph received, inspired by his review of the Bible with Sidney. But whatever it is, clearly based on the fact that we have the inspired translation, there is much that is missing or needs to be added to or changed in the Bible. There's this quote again. I apologize. I didn't get the Community of Christ references in here, but we have this quote that God gives our understanding in our own language. So we have this concept that the Bible was given in the terms that the people could understand at the time, but we might have other understandings of the Bible, and then even the Bible itself, you have Jeremiah, who would have been a contemporary of Lehi, where there's even some stuff that kind of leaked through the Deuteronomists. Again, this is from the Margaret Barker school point of view. They argue that there's a lot of stuff in the Old Testament that got past the Deuteronomist censors, and this would include Jeremiah 8:8, where he says, the pen of the scribe is in vain, and wise men are that they think they are wise, but the argument is that Jeremiah is directly attacking in this verse, and in much of the book of Jeremiah, he's directly attacking the Deuteronomists, and that was why he was persecuted. Okay, so I will kind of go through this point quickly. This is sort of the conclusion. So the advantage of what's intriguing about Margaret Barker is that she uses the historical critical method. Her books are full of footnotes. She has hundreds of footnotes. The articles she writes are full of footnotes. They're published by distinguished and respectable Bible journals. She uses the historical critical method in full, accepts many of their assumptions, like, for example, that the religion of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was not monotheistic. So she plays by the Bible world's rules, and knows she's extremely fluent in all the ancient languages. She cites all the sources. So this is why even the people who disagree with her or think she's not that relevant have respect for her work. So my argument is this: she's playing by the other side's rules, and that can be tough. So I have figure skating here where the judgments are made by judges that I cannot figure out how they do that. You have strange rules, like I have here rugby, although Margaret Barker, being British, might understand the rules of rugby. I'm just making the point here is that she plays by the other side's rules.
Cricket.
But she has assembled, so she's approached the Bible as a jigsaw puzzle, the way that the historical critical method does, but she has assembled a puzzle in a way that leads to Christ and that leads to the Book of Mormon. So this is my jigsaw puzzle I found that's a good Christian jigsaw puzzle. That's kind of how Margaret Barker has reassembled the Old Testament with her research. So anyway, this is Val is going to elaborate more on this in his presentation next week. So let's ask the final question. Again, what does this, how does this help us? A secular scholar will say, and they have said, that, Margaret Barker is brilliant. She cites all the best sources. She knows her languages. She knows her stuff cold. She's brilliant, but she's in the end just another Christian in a line going back to the writers of the Gospels, right? The writers of the Gospels were making arguments, especially Matthew, that, you know, Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies. And, you know, they say she's just trying to find Jesus in the Old Testament when he is not there. So that's sort of the secular rebuttal. And of course, the fundamentalists will say that she's just another historical critical person, and that her rejection of parts of the Bible, which she argues were, you know, either, I mean, she also argues that large sections, significant parts of the Bible, especially dealing with the First Temple period, were stricken by the Deuteronomist censors or rewriters, plain and precious things. And they say, no, no, every word of the Bible is true and the Bible is complete. And, you know, long live King Josiah. So neither one of them would accept her views as being mainstream. So my kind of concluding argument here is that this doesn't prove the Book of Mormon, you know, like a closed, open and shut case, but it's a approach to making the Book of Mormon more plausible. In other words, it's like in a game, you don't make many 3-pointers in a basketball game. If your whole strategy in a basketball game was to do nothing but make 3-pointers, you would not win the game. Instead, the best strategy for a basketball game is to just do all the things that you need to do, including racking up the 2-pointers. And so another example, and this is something I think we've had presentations on this before, is another non-LDS Englishman who, this is Philip Beale, whose voyage, I think Boyd Tuttle may have presented on this. You know, he reconstructed a Phoenician ship from the 6th century BCE and sailed it. He was originally trying to circumnavigate Africa, and he inadvertently proved that you could get from the place in Oman where we believe the land Bountiful was to the Americas by sail. Now, that doesn't prove that Lehi did that, but it suddenly makes it much more plausible. So that's just another example of another of our non-LDS English friends who have come up with cool stuff that just make the Book of Mormon more plausible. So my conclusion here is that if you accumulate 100 2-pointers, you've got probably a pretty good basketball game. So I would argue that the value of Margaret Barker isn't that there's any one thing that absolutely proves the Book of Mormon, but that rather this vast body of scholarship she has, which is completely compatible with the views of the Book of Mormon, are 100 2-pointers and successful foul shots that Joseph Smith could never have known for the purpose of convincing the Jew and the Gentile that Jesus is the Christ, the eternal God, and manifests himself to all nations. So that's my presentation. And I'm stopping my share.
Thank you, James. I like to claim that first prerogative of the first question, and in anticipation of your presentation, I looked and reread a bit, and it impressed me that Deuteronomy, and you can clarify whether it's more from the Deuteronomist vantage point or perhaps previous to that, but the Deuteronomy approach to Scripture is with God giving commandments, mandates, whereas in the vision of Lehi, the book of Nephi, there's much more of an enticement, God enticing people to the better way of life. How does that fit into this overall picture you're presenting us of the Deuteronomists?
Well, this was very much a piece of Margaret Barker's argument, is that it was the Deuteronomists who changed the religion of Israel from one that relied on visions and prophecies and so forth to one that relied on law and strict adherence to rigid prescriptions and so forth. So that is, so that's you've you illustrated one of the many illustrations of how the faith of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was, as reflected by the visions of Nephi and Lehi, was a far more, as you say, of an invitation, of a vision of glory, an invitation to glory, whereas the Deuteronomists were, locked down, much more rigid, and pushed what really became Judaism much more toward the law and so forth. I mean, the Deuteronomists were the direct predecessors, by a kind of a convoluted history, but they were definitely the predecessors of the Sadducees, and then later of the Pharisees. And yes, we see in the New Testament how those folks reacted to Christ's message. So yes, no, that would be very much a piece of it. And that's, again, if you look at First Nephi, this is the argument Laman and Lemuel make. They say, we follow the law. We follow the law. The people of Jerusalem were righteous people. They followed the law. So what are you complaining about, Nephi and Father, Lehi, Father Lehi? The Book of Mormon shows Laman and Lemuel making those arguments.
Fascinating to see how much of this dichotomy continues through our conservative liberal framework today. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm anxious to get the rest of the questions, and I see Wednesday has her hand up.
Thank you for your presentation, James, and I know Val, you worked on it too, so thank you as well. So I recently, through a program at Graceland, I got to take a Hebrew Bible class, and so I see what you mean about the Deuteronomists, and what was and how the relation, the early, I guess they would have been Hebrew at the time. The early Hebrew religion was not monotheistic. This is something that came later, and you can look and see where Deuteronomists went and erased gods and changed names of people that referred to different gods and stuff. Mm-hmm. So thank you for bringing that to the forefront. But something that I had a question about was, so I know Jehovah is also is the Latinized Yahweh. So we're talking the same there. And so Yahweh is El and Asherah's son. I'm trying to look, how do we, are you saying that this is a foretelling? I'm trying to connect that to, I see the parallel with Heavenly Mother, Heavenly Father, and Jesus Christ. But how is it foreseeing it? Because in my mind, for some reason, I see I think I'm starting to get it. Never mind. I was trying to see how you had that be a prophecy rather than something that is, and then for to prophesy, how does it prophesize the coming of Christ? There we go. How does that? I see the parallel there, and I'm with you. But how does it foretell the coming of Christ?
Oh well, because when you see Yahweh, Jehovah, as God the Son, separate from God the Father, Elohim, and God the Mother, who is often referred to as Asherah. You then, that tradition, Margaret argues, was maintained in Israel all the way up until the time of Christ, even despite the efforts of the Deuteronomists to wash it away. And that is what the Christians of the New Testament were drawing upon, was this ancient tradition that God the Father and God the Son were in fact separate entities, and this are separate beings, separate deities. And this, of course, is a huge difficulty in the New Testament. They're always having to, Jesus is constantly, saying, I do the will of my Father. I'm here. I do what my Father does. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father, and this is one of the great objections that people have to Jesus, is because here's this man, and he's comparing himself to God the Father, and yet he does, and that's why you get the great John 17, where you kind of get this elaborate explanation of how it is that Jesus and the Father are one in purpose, but even though they're separate beings. And of course, this gives rise to the whole issue of the Trinity and so on and so forth. So the argument, leaving aside the Book of Mormon, is that Margaret Barker makes, is that, in fact, if you go back and look at the ancient religion of Israel, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, in fact, there is a tradition of their God the Son, and that this is what Jesus is. He's the manifestation of God the Son. And then, of course, this is reinforced by the Book of Mormon, where Nephi and Lehi have very specific visions prophesying the coming of the Messiah. And this is work that folks like Val and John Butler have done in much more detail, and maybe Val will be speaking about this more next week. But you have in the visions of Nephi and Lehi, which appear at the beginning of the Book of Mormon, you have many manifestations in symbolism of the God the Mother also, of the Heavenly Mother also. And the fact that, and then you have the fact that the figure of Mary is brought forward so prominently in Nephi's vision, and that the imagery that's used is the exact same imagery that was used to describe Asherah, God the Mother, in the ancient religion of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So those are ways in which it all it carries through in both the Old Testament and in the Old World, and in the prophecies that are found in the New World.
Thank you.
Hey, Blair, good evening. It's your turn.
Okay, got unmuted.
Yep.
Okay.
This is fascinating. It's a period of time that I've been studying for some period, but without the understanding of what was Margaret, what's her name?
Barker with the B.
Barker.
Right.
Without understanding it or knowing of her, it gels very well with what my studies have shown. And there's yet an area that's similar to this that puzzles me no end. And that is, what form of writing was being used? You see, I'm preparing for this study of how to read the Book of Mormon, the transcript, the characters transcript.
Right.
And it keeps coming up to me, what kind of writing did they have? Now, we're told that they didn't have anything but Proto-Hebrew, which was essentially what the Phoenicians were using and all the Semitic tribes were using at that time. Do we have any samples of the kind of writing that were there in that day and age? Because the Deuteronomist would have to have been writing in something that is not recognizable Hebrew today, because that didn't come until after the Babylonian captivity.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of writing was done? Was it that flexible that they could make good records in that day?
Well, this
or
is
were they going on oral tradition and sketchy words of Phoenician Proto-Hebrew? Because Lehi took the brass plates away from Jerusalem, that was the master Old Testament.
Mhm.
They didn't have that anymore. When they were going into captivity, and all of those Deuteronomists were rewriting all those scriptures, what alphabet were they using?
Well, this is, one of the great mysteries of Bible scholarship, because the earliest actual manuscripts we have are, as I'm sure you're aware, hundreds of years later. And yet, if you read the Old Testament, they treat it as though they had all kinds of records and they had all kinds of books and so on and so forth. And yet, the archaeologists, as I understand it, have found just bits and pieces of actual writing, in doing their archaeology and so forth. And as you note, it all is in a kind of a proto-Semitic kind of an alphabet. That's all they found, but they certainly have not found any kind of extensive written record. These are like little 3-word things on a stamp or something like that. As I understand it, is all that we have. So it's as my understanding is that this is a mystery of biblical scholarship. I think that my understanding of the secular scholarly view is that it was carried to Babylon all as oral tradition, and that they then in Babylon started to say, whoa, we don't we don't have our homeland, we don't have our temple, we don't have anything, we better start writing this stuff down. And that's when they started to write it down in in a kind of early Hebrew alphabet that they had picked up from their Semitic neighbors, like the Phoenicians. And then it kind of evolved over the next 600 years up through the time of the 1st century before Christ, which is the first time we start to really now finally have some manuscripts like the Dead Sea Scrolls, where we actually have the real documents. So, I mean, I'm not an expert in this area, but that's my understanding, and it would not conflict with, so it is very much in line with what you're asking, which is that the Old Testament is such a huge document, how, where'd they get it from if they were in fact just, carrying on an oral tradition, writing down an oral tradition finally, because there is, it's a big, huge document. So that's a good question. And
let me jump in on and just say a little bit more about it. The Book of Mormon itself suggests that they had two different traditions, writing traditions. So of course, Joseph in Egypt was learned in Egyptian, and he had been very prominent there. And the Book of Mormon suggests that they had two scribal traditions, one in Egyptian, that using Egyptian script, but to tell the Hebrew stories, and then the other one using some kind of a Hebrew script. And you're talking about, it could be the Proto-Hebrew script, or we don't know exactly what Hebrew script, but the Book of Mormon suggests they did have some kind of Hebrew script, but they also had this Egyptian script. And so the Book of Mormon, we would think the text you're looking at, and I think from judging from the presentations I've seen from you all, you were kind of looking at the Egyptian to get a lot of your meaning from that text you have. And Jerry Grover, I know, was looking at Egyptian pretty heavy when he came and made the presentation. So actually there would be two different scripts, one that was recording Hebrew, another that was recording the Hebrew stories, but with roots in Egyptian writing. And that's what the Book of Mormon tradition had.
That's basically my understanding too, Val. Now, because Mormon complains, or I guess it's Moroni that complains that he is difficulty expressing himself in this writing form. And if he could write in Hebrew, he would have, we would be able to understand what he's saying better.
Mhm. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for your views, Ed.
Thanks,
Thank
Blair.
you.
Roger Gilbert and then Paul. Go ahead, Roger.
Okay, James, thanks for that great presentation. It makes me think of a couple of things. One is, it's always gratifying to see someone outside the rest of research that is beneficial to the restoration. But I think this topic is probably the most, maybe the most interesting thing about the Book of Mormon is the Jesus Christ in the Old Testament, and not just the cryptic references that we get in our Old Testament, but very specific, specific prophecies, long stories about Jesus and his name and everything. So, for myself, growing up in the Restoration, that's just part of the beauty of it. But looking from a non-restoration point of view, that's a very difficult, I would say very difficult, if not impossible barrier that doesn't make sense. And it may not make sense because it seems like all the Bible Old Testament references are cryptic. They're cryptic. They're one verse. They're a phrase or two here. They don't say Jesus Christ. All those kinds of things. So it's not difficult to understand the maybe confusion or lack of being able to believe in just the whole personhood of Jesus as we see him in the Book of Mormon. So I'm rambling here and trying to come up with a question. I guess my question is, with all your research and everything, your books and all, what's your thoughts on that, of why maybe it's so clear about Jesus and his personhood and all his prophecies are so clear in the Book of Mormon, and yet so cryptic, and you almost have to be a Bible researcher in some cases to really try to pull those things out of our Old Testament. So I don't know if I got much of a question in there, but that's my thoughts.
Okay, no, that's again, sort of channeling Margaret Barker a little bit. I think that her answer and the answer that this sort of paradigm that she's introduced would be that the reason that the Old Testament references to the Messiah are cryptic, as you say, is because they were edited out. All the good stuff was edited out by the Deuteronomists, and because they were trying to merge Elohim and Jehovah into a single God to try to become, introduce monotheistic ideas, and therefore, this idea that there is a son of God who would come forth is not compatible with their program. So they took off all that. Margaret Barker would argue that that stuff actually was in the Old Testament, but it was taken out. As the Book of Mormon tells us, plain and precious things were removed. And just to kind of be very brief here, but she finds this in the Apocrypha, in various apocryphal writings. She finds it in accounts of the temple in the Old Testament. She finds it in sort of, in the cracks, so to speak. She finds it by kind of going back into the biblical Hebrew and kind of retranslating some of the material and saying, well, our modern translations say this, but actually the Hebrew really says that. So anyway, these are all the ways in which she resurfaces or has tried to resurface the messianic aspects of the Old Testament. And then, of course, as Book of Mormon believers, we would argue that God then supplemented the stuff that really actually was in the Old Testament that would have been available on the plates of Laban, and supplemented them with new visions and revelations to Lehi and Nephi of the coming of the Messiah. So that was new stuff that we only have because we have the record of the Book of Mormon. So it's kind of two pieces. The Margaret Barker's reconstructing the plain and precious things that are missing from the Old Testament, by this very clever looking in the cracks to argue that it really is there. You just gotta, look for it. And of course, we have the Book of Mormon has new revelations about the coming of the Messiah that were given to Nephi and Lehi.
Yeah, I think I can probably for the most part buy into that. But it's because of my tradition. My Protestant friends look at that and say, it's just downright sacrilegious. You got to be kidding me. Something's been removed from the Bible. So anyway, it's a tough one, but it's appreciated that she has done some great work there. That is a very, very tough concept for my good friends, I would say.
Well, she comes at this, it's because she's such a strong believer in Christ. And I would think this would be true to some extent it's certainly true in the New Testament. They're looking for Christ in the Old Testament. They want to see him there because if he is who he claims to be, he should be there. So they'll say that most Protestants will say, yeah, Christ is in the Old Testament. They've got to find him there somehow. And Margaret is just especially diligent about and scholarly about finding him there. They do find, I'll give you a couple of examples. One example she gives is they had a bunch of people that were weaving things for Asherah that are described there in that Deuteronomist period near the Gihon spring, which was associated with the temple. In the Old Testament, and the King James translators also build on this, they had a word which could be translated as the holy ones, Kodeshim, the holy ones, and they translated that in the King James version, building a little bit on a little changes that were made because they have to put in the points. It's not actually written in the Hebrew. You have to put in the vowels, and it could be either the holy ones or it could be the Sodomites. And Margaret sees those people that were doing the worship of the Divine Mother as holy ones, and the King James folks turned them into Sodomites because they don't want to be there. And when they get to the place where we do have manuscripts, which would be in the New Testament period, we do have some evidence that the Jews at that time, once the Christians came along and were making these claims about the Old Testament, there's some evidence that the Jews then started making some changes in their manuscripts. The passages that the Christians were citing, they didn't want them to be there because they were fighting against the Christians. They had good reason for trying to get rid of that. So Margaret is basically saying that same thing was going on earlier, and that's where you really get a lot of changes. And then because she reads Hebrew so well, she often will say, this is what it was, and I can see how it was changed to take Christ out. So if you start getting into her books, you'll find quite a few examples where she's making the case that Christ is there, as should be expected by Christians, and here's where he's being taken out.
Thank you.
Okay, Paul, and then Terry.
Question first, and then I want to follow it with a comment. To what extent was Muhammad, or are the Muslims influenced by the Deuteronomists? Now, I raised the question, but then I want to go back because Enid DeBarth, who happens to have been David, my mother, wrote a book on her quest for understanding. She dug into these issues with well, as much as an Iowa farm lady could, I think. But she was very interested in this and was exploring the early nature of the divine, and saw then that fundamentally the Muslims and the Jews worship the same set of gods, which both got modified into one god later on. But because she got into that, and you ask about the influence that Margaret Baker has had, I think that there's one person that I can cite that was acquainted with that Deuteronomist approach. Anyway, I'm curious what you think in terms of the influence of the Deuteronomists on modern Islam, and when you go back to the nature of the divine, it would appear that both Judaism and Islam and Christianity go back to a common network of deities.
Well, I'll say quickly that yes, clearly Islam draws on Judeo-Christian, beliefs. My understanding, and I'm not too expert on the origins of Islam, so I have to be very cautious here. But my understanding is that Islam reflects later Judeo-Christian ideas. In other words, the Quran was produced in the 7th century CE, in other words, after Christ. This is after Christians have been around for hundreds of years, and Jews have been around for thousands of years. And so my understanding is that to the extent that one can argue that Islam is built off of the Judeo-Christian tradition or heritage, it reflects a later version of that. So it reflects a Judaism that's 1,000 years after the Deuteronomists, after the Deuteronomists have already done their work and become mainstream, Judaism, and that it also reflects Christian ideas that are already hundreds of years past the time of Christ. So I'm not, sure how many direct lines we could draw from this period of 600 BCE to 600 CE, more than 1,000 years later when Islam appears. But again, I emphasize that I'm don't claim any particular knowledge on the history of Islam, but I would think that while clearly no one disputes that they have some common roots, I don't know if you could draw many direct lines between this, 600 BCE Jewish reform or movement and what Muhammad came up with in 600 BCE, over 1,000 years later.
I think the argument that can be made is 600 BC is a pivotal moment in that they're going from believing in a pantheon of multiple corporeal gods in that moment to one God, and to the Jews that excludes the Son of God. So there's no Son of God, and of course the Muslims don't have any Son of God. So the idea is Eya Asher Eya, I am that I am. It's really sophisticated sort of philosophical reasoning that they go from these beings that are like humans, that they have bodies and they have a kind of royal court, a divine royal court was the idea they'd had up to about 600 BC. The Deuteronomists are changing that to have the God that is just one God, sort of outside of time and space. It's at least the incipient beginnings of that. And when they get down to the Christian period, the Christ is coming along saying there's a God with God, and the Deuteronomy says I am God and there is no God with me. So the Sadducees, the Pharisees, all those people that are opposing Jesus are very much holding to the idea that there can just be this one being, and there cannot be any other being with him. The Christians start using Greek thought. And so you have Aristotle who's talking about the unmoved mover. So the Greeks had an idea that was kind of similar, and you clearly get a melding of Greek philosophy and this Jewish theology, and then the Christians also trying to work with both the Jewish ideas and the Greek ideas, and that becomes a kind of again. You get the ideas of Trinity coming out of the Christians as they meld the Greek and the Hebrew together to get the one God, but also have three. And then the Muslims, when they come along, they're more in harmony with the Jewish idea. I mean, there's not very, oddly enough, given all the tension between them, the Jews and the Muslims are pretty much have the same idea of God. I mean, Allah is just a one God, just as the Jewish God. They're not Trinitarian, they think of Christ as a prophet, and the Jews don't even think of him as a prophet. But our argument, in part, would be that the idea that the Jews have today, that the mainstream Christian world has today, and that the Muslims have today, all of them have kind of the same God, but with the Trinity being the main sort of modification of that, 3 in 1 being. But that older religion had corporeal beings, and father and mother and son, and all of them being distinctive and looking like people and that sort of thing. And of course, as Latter-day Saints, that's how we think of God. So we're saying that is the pivotal moment in theological history, the emergence, or there's a split, and it's a split between Judaism, Orthodox Christianity, and I'm using a small o Orthodox Christianity, but it would also include the big O Orthodox Christians here, and the Muslims. All of them have a fairly similar kind of idea of God, but it's very different than the LDS version of God. And the LDS version of God is much more like that pre-Deuteronomist conception.
Okay. Terry Walker, and then Kenneth, I see you waving, so you'll be after Terry. Go ahead, Terry.
Okay, I have 2 questions. Would it be fair to say that the Sanhedrin at the time of Christ is the epitome of the Deuteronomists?
Yeah, that they're very much the successors to the Deuteronomists.
Right. Okay, thank you. Okay, the next question is, it's my understanding that the main language of the Mediterranean area at the time of Christ was Aramaic. What are did Aramaic have a written parcel as well as just a spoken? And what are the origins of Aramaic?
Well, my understanding is that, yes, Aramaic had a written form, that Aramaic was actually a form of Persian that the Jews had picked up during the Babylonian captivity. But that actually at the time of Christ, so Jews would have, the people of Israel would have spoken Aramaic, which they inherited from the time of the Babylonian captivity. And they would have spoken Hebrew, which they would have learned in their religious studies, but that the real lingua franca of that era was Greek.
Okay.
If you went outside of your own little community, I was almost like English in the modern world. You just had to be bilingual. in whatever your local language was, be that Aramaic or Hebrew or whatever, and then you spoke Greek to everybody else.
Okay, thank you.
I think what they would have had is, see, Alexander the Great was, I think, about 300 years before Christ. And Alexander the Great is the one that made Greek the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean. But before that, the Mediterranean, that Eastern Mediterranean had been dominated by the Babylonian area. And that's when Aramaic was actually the lingua franca of every place. And that's why that was a residue that still existed as the common language of Christ and other Hebrews living there. It was their native language. The Greek was, as Jim says, like English, it was a second language that if two people were, if a Roman was going to talk with a Jew, was going to talk with a Persian or something, they would use Greek because of the influence of Alexander the Great. But they'd had an older lingua franca there too, and that still was around, and that was Aramaic.
So there is a possible link between the Jews that were in the Babylonian conquest, that if Persian was the root of Aramaic, they could have had some religious similarities there then that the Deuteronomists ignored or were against, right?
I don't know for sure. Aramaic is a Semitic language, and I'm not positive that Persian is. It might be.
Yeah, I might be wrong about that. It was the language they picked up during the Babylonian captivity.
Yeah, so the Persians had come in and conquered Babylon. They were an outside group, and I don't know for certain what Persian is, but Aramaic was definitely a Semitic language. It's a related language to Hebrew, and it had become the lingua franca and was what was used for all the different nations under the Persians when they took over. The Babylonians had already been there. Everybody spoke the Aramaic language, and that's what they used as a common language.
So those poor people that were part of the Babylonian conquest were exposed to all kinds of stuff that they probably never got over then.
That's one of the things where we aren't sufficiently grateful for the peace that we've enjoyed. Every one of us that's alive as an American today, it's like we've had battles elsewhere, but not one of us have had our home invaded by foreigners. And I think we too little appreciate that, and we too little appreciate the value of kind of just the oceans and American power and the various things have made it so we've not had the normal historical experience. I mean, it's just normal to have people coming and you're invading all the time. And we see that in the Bible.
Okay, well, thank you, James. That was a nice presentation. I appreciated it.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Terry. Kenny, go ahead, please.
Okay, I got the three Bibles compared. I think the real question I'm kind of hinting at is, has the Bible been changed back when to now? Well, I would say yes, for this very reason. In Exodus 32 and 14 in the King James Version, and the Lord repented of the evil which he sought to do unto his people. In the Inspired Version, it says, and the Lord said unto Moses, if they will repent of the evil which they have done, I will spare them and turn away my fierce wrath. Okay, if you look someplace else, like Numbers 23:19 in the King James, says God is not a man that he should repent, or a son of man are doing that. But and that agrees with the inspired version where God's not repenting. Well, if the King James is right, there's conflict in the Bible of whether God repents or not. In the inspired version, which Joseph Smith corrected, it all matches. I'll say about that much.
Okay, no, and this is, thank you. That's a good illustration of, the point I was making earlier, which is that we in the restoration traditions, because we all look back to the inspired translation Joseph Smith did of the Bible, recognize that, the Bible is not letter perfect, and clearly is, it has its mistakes and errors, and clearly is we need to take a kind of a little bit flexible attitude toward the Bible. So thank you for the example.
Val's put a comment in the chat
Oops.
and it just went away on me.
Oh.
Persian was an Indo-European, not a Semitic language. It's related to most of the European and ancient languages of India, not to Hebrew or Aramaic. Thanks, Val. Paul, go ahead, please.
I want to raise the question about the Phoenician language as the trade language of this period, and its profound impact upon the modern world with its alphabet, because there, I think, is another of those significant cultural factors for the time. I also wanted to highlight that last week I found in the Joseph Smith home a copy of the two records. It is 1892, published at the Herald in Lamoni, the large print Book of Mormon in the first part, and then the last part is the inspired version of the New Testament in the second part of the book. So the two records in 1892, for the first time, they actually got the print size large so a person could read without a magnifying glass, and then it was combined with the inspired version. So very interesting that in Lamoni in 1892 they were actually putting those two records together and attempting to highlight how significant they were. It is rather unfortunate, I think, that that now is classified as one of the very rare books, one that's rarely found.
Okay, very interesting.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands at this moment.
Well, then that's probably a good sign for us to conclude for tonight and anticipate a continuation next week with Val bringing us up on the Nauvoo side. And of course, I'm going to be especially interested in that because I've spent so much time there. But yeah, let me see.
What I will mostly be doing, Paul, is just closely reading the Book of Mormon, but suggesting that some of the later ideas that emerged in Nauvoo are there in the Book of Mormon. So I'm not really looking at Nauvoo very much. I'm looking at the Book of Mormon, but the reading I'm giving will find some of these older pre-Deuteronomist theologies in the Book of Mormon. So that's kind of the thrust of my presentation.
Very good. Interesting. Yeah, certainly what you guys are presenting is an opportunity for us to stretch and grow, and I appreciate very much. That's one of the delights of the educational process. Good night, the Lord is watching o'er you. Good night, his blessings go before you. Good night, and we'll be praying for you. So good night, may God bless you. Or stick around and chat a little bit more if you like.
Nope.